I know the White House has been pretty clear that due to the unique situation of January 6th, that executive privilege is not a top concern about precedent. But I'm wondering, given the unique nature of a White House counsel's position, is there any conversations about whether that sets a precedent for a White House counsel going forward to have to answer to Congress about deliberations inside the White House?
Let me just first say, when it comes to January 6th, the hearings, the select committee, what we're seeing, it is important. The president believes it's important to get to the bottom of what happened, for the American public to see for themselves and get all the information that they can on what happened on that day. So as it comes to executive privilege, there is no privilege for trying to overthrow the government. That's what the president believes. That's why the president has consistently declined to assert executive privilege with respect to documents or testimony about the extraordinary events under investigation by the January 6th committee. We're going to continue to defer to the committee as it conducts its bipartisan independent investigation. Okay.
Thanks, Green. On Brittany Griner, you were there when the president read Griner's letter. What was his reaction, and did he express any message for Griner and her family?
So I'm not going to share any personal interaction that I had with the president. I just wanted to confirm that he did read the letter, and I will say, again, this is very personal to him. Especially when someone writes a letter in such a personal way. We have made this a priority. We have, Secretary Blinken, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has spoken to Mrs. Griner and her teammates and her family, and so we're going to continue to keep that open communication and have very honest conversations with them. They're private conversations, so I'm not going to share what those conversations have been. But this is also the case with all U.S. nationals abroad. Again, this is a priority for U.S. nationals who are abroad, who are wrongfully detained. It is important to the president to bring them home safely, just like we saw with Trevor Reed very recently ago. And so we're going to continue to make that a priority, but I'm not going to share any private conversations.
And just to follow up on the pleas from the Griner family on wanting to personally speak with the president after reading this letter, is that something that the White House at this point is considering?
I just don't have anything to share on what communication the president's going to have with Mrs. Griner and her family. All I can confirm is that he's read the letter and he's making this a priority. Okay, Trevor.
First, just on the Illinois shooting, Illinois already has a red flag law. It isn't used that often. It wasn't used in this case, even though the suspect apparently had put some violent imagery online. Is your expectation that the gun bill that just passed is something that would have addressed this kind of situation?
So I want to be very clear. Yes, the bipartisan gun reform bill was an important first step. It was the first step that we have seen in 30 years. The last time was when this president led the banning assault weapons legislation that lasted for about 10 years and sunset in 2004. And so the president believes that we need to make sure that we ban assault weapons, right? That is one of the things that's being reported that this suspect had. And so banning assault weapons is something, again, that he's going to continue to fight for. With that said, he understands that there's more work to be done. The bipartisan bill is going to save some lives. Like, that is true. It will save some lives, but we need more. We need to do more work, and the president's going to continue to do that fight. What we know, one thing I would say about red flag laws, as we've seen them over the past several years, is that when they are implemented, they do work in red states and in blue states, and they are also very much in line of what majority of Americans support. So again, when they're actually enacted, red flags laws are actually effective.
And do you? I know you don't have any travel to confirm, but does the president want to go to Illinois?
I just don't have anything to say about any travel to Illinois.
Okay, and then just one other thing that I wanted: is it accurate that the White House was planning to nominate this anti-abortion Republican judge Chad Meredith for a federal judgeship in Kentucky the day that Roe v. Wade was decided?
So we make it a point here to not comment on any vacancy, whether it is on the executive branch or judicial branch, especially those that the nomination has not been made yet. So I don't have anything to say on that. It is something that we just don't comment on.
Will the president ever appoint a judge who doesn't support abortion rights to the federal bench?
I mean, that's a hypothetical that I can't really speak to.
That's not a litmus test for him, though.
Well, I'm not gonna go on to litmus tests. All I can tell you is that we don't normally speak on vacancies where we haven't made a decision yet, whether it's on the judicial level or the executive branch. Go ahead.
You've mentioned Trevor Reed a couple times. His release is part of a prisoner swap. Should we view that as a viable option when it comes to Brittany Griner or Paul Whelan or others?
I cannot speak to any discussions that are happening on how any U.S. national who's being held abroad and wrongfully detained, what the process is going to be to bring them home. I just cannot speak to that from here.
Is there a broad kind of contextual structure in which you look at prisoner swaps? Like, why was that considered an okay thing in the Trevor Reed case? Is there kind of a construct the administration follows?
Again, I cannot speak about that from here. Clearly, there are security and privacy reasons to not discuss the details of how a release happens. So it's not something that I can speak from here. I can say that we have a special envoy, that this is their focus. We are in constant communication with them on their process, but it is just for safety, security reasons. This is not something that I can speak from here.
Just one more on a different subject than the China competition bill that Jordan asked about. The Senate passed that more than a year ago. Is there a concern that it was allowed to linger for too long and in fact gave Senator McConnell the opportunity to put the roadblocks he's put up in front now because he didn't move on it until 13 months later?
Look, it's unfortunate that Senator McConnell has taken this approach. Clearly, that's not an approach that's going to help the American public. That's how we see it. This competition bill is important for many reasons. So we're going to continue to work with Congress to get this done. And so we're going to just continue that process. I'm not going to go into any personal conversations or negotiations, as we tend to say from here. But again, this is an important piece of legislation that we would like to see move forward.
Great, thank you. Yesterday, President Biden, in his first opportunity to address the public in person on the shooting, he did so sort of very obliquely and fleetingly, and then he came back out on stage about 2 hours later and spoke a little more. Was that because he or his team felt he had initially missed the mark?
No, he felt that he needed to speak on that himself. That was his own decision to move.
He came out and he verbally said at the 4th of July, you all heard what happened today. Things will get better still, but not without more hard work. And then 2 hours later that same evening, he came out and said a bit more.
My answer is still the same. He wanted to make sure that he had an opportunity to speak to this, and he took that opportunity that second time. He spoke to it very briefly, as you just stated, the first time, and the second time, he got on stage and wanted to give an update. He actually, if you remember, he gave an update of what was currently happening, and he gave a moment of silence. That was him. That was something he decided to do.
Following up on that, Governor Pritzker said in a press conference, he said he was furious. It was a time to be angry. You have said, referring to what President Biden said, that he spoke forcefully yesterday. He spoke with urgency. I guess I just want to make sure I understand. Do you and the president believe saying you all heard what happened today after yet another mass shooting? Is that your definition of forceful and urgent?
What I'm saying is that there's been many times that the president has spoken forcefully, urgently, about a moment that currently exists in our country, which is a gun violence epidemic. And he has done that in prime time on many of your colleagues' networks. He has done it in Uvalde after coming back from Uvalde, after he met with parents and family members and they're dealing with their devastation. He did that in Buffalo as well, and he has shown over and over again how important this issue is. And it's not just important during his presidency. It's been important when he was a vice president, and it was important when he was a senator. So to say that this president has not shown urgency is just false.
And last final follow-up on that, on what we were just talking about, which is guns, but also on a range of issues, abortion rights, the threat to American democracy. Why do you think so many members of your own party, elected leaders, voters, activists, pundits, why do they all seem to, in this moment, disagree with that assessment?
Well, I can't speak for them. I can only speak to what we're trying to do. I can only speak to. Again, I'm not going to speak for them. I would go directly to these folks, these activists, and our Democratic colleagues, and speak to them directly. And I'm sure they will give you a very clear response on why they feel that way. Look. This is a president that has been working tirelessly every day in and day out since he's walked into this administration, fighting for the American public. That is what matters to him. That is what is important, is delivering every way that he can to make sure that we get things done. I mean, let's not forget, while again, there's more work to be done, there was a bipartisan gun reform piece of legislation that has been done that has not been done in 30 years. That matters. Is there more work to be done? Absolutely. Is he going to call for more action and do the best that he can? Absolutely. This is also a president in his first year of office has had more executive actions on gun reform, on fighting gun violence than any other president at this time. So that matters as well. His actions should speak as well for how he's delivered for the American public. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. I know you said the White House doesn't comment on judicial vacancies, but in this case, the White House already provided an intention to nominate to Kentucky Governor Beshear, that it would intend to nominate Chad Meredith on June 23rd. So does the president plan to nominate this individual who has come under criticism for being, from Democrats in Kentucky and nationally, for being an anti-abortion attorney and a member of the Federalist Society?
Again, I'm not going to comment on something that has not been decided on, that on any open vacancies. It is an open vacancy, and so I'm just not going to comment from here.
Is there any deal with Leader McConnell regarding this judgeship that the president has entered into, whereby McConnell wouldn't hold up certain judicial appointments moving forward?
I'm just not going to comment on an open vacancy at this point.
To all this angry response from a lot of Democrats in Kentucky, Representative Sean Yarmouth, Andy Beshear, others who have criticized that Biden would nominate somebody who stands against abortion and holds conservative views?
Well, we haven't nominated anyone. That's what I would say as of yet. Okay, I guess I got everybody. Go ahead.
Thank you.
No, go ahead.
Thank you. Following the Highland Park shooting, President Biden's 4th of July message was telling Americans to make sure they vote, but he didn't make an explicit call for Congress to act. So is that tacit acknowledgement that he sees Congress as it stands right now unlikely to take any additional action?
Can you say the beginning part of your question?
Well, in his 4th of July message,
yeah,
he urged Americans to go to the polls and vote, but he didn't specifically say Congress needs to act.
Act on, is there something
act
particular?
on gun control legislation. So is that tacit acknowledgement that Congress as it stands right now cannot do that?
Well, Congress did act on gun reform. There was a bipartisan bill that was passed.
Is he frustrated that it didn't go far enough?
I mean, the president has been very clear that we need to go further on the gun reform, that he is pleased that there is that he was able to sign a bipartisan gun reform bill, and that has been the first time again in 30 years that we have seen that type of reform, or any type of reform. Do we need to do more? Absolutely. He has been very clear on that. One of the things that I just mentioned a few moments ago was banning assault weapons. That is something that, as we saw yesterday, we saw an assault weapon was used in a horrific event yesterday in Highland Park. So that is something that he led on 30 years ago, and he wants to continue to see that happen again, the banning of assault weapons.
Is that something he believes this Congress can accomplish?
I mean, look, this Congress was able to do a bipartisan gun reform legislation. So we're going to continue to work with members in Congress to see what else we can do.
Since those mass shootings, has he called any members of Congress? Has he planned to set up any meetings? A mass shooting just happened. We're just trying to understand what he's done since then.
Well, I mean, again, we saw a gun reform bipartisan legislation pass. He signed that into law, which was a first step. Yesterday, this happened yesterday. You heard directly from the president in a statement. He spoke on this twice yesterday. We are always in constant communication with members of Congress on a slew of a long list of issues that are important to the American public, and so we will continue to have those conversations.
Is it my turn now?
Thanks, Kareem. Just a kind of specific question. In a statement today, several prominent congressional Democrats criticized President Biden over his comments last week, saying that he supports selling F-16 fighter jets to Turkey. I'm just curious if the White House has any response to that criticism, which came from
Is it because after Erdogan's meeting that he had at NATO?
Yeah.
Is that what this is coming from? So we've been very clear about this. The F-16, that conversation about the F-16 and Turkey has been around for some time. We've talked about this several months ago. So there's really nothing new. The president has supported that effort. So there's really nothing new to that.
A Middle East question, and
Yeah.
I'm going to take this. A Middle East question and also a Ukraine question. Let me start with the Middle East. A U.S. District Court judge has given the administration until August 1st to decide whether to grant immunity to the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia in a civil lawsuit filed by his fiancée, obviously in relation to his death. I'm just wondering if the president's willing or ready to weigh in on that, or if that's going to happen during his trip, or if that's something he's going to discuss with the Saudis.
So that's a legal determination, so I cannot comment from here on that because it's a legal determination.
Cool, let's move on to Ukraine then. Can I just get the White House's assessment on these recent Russian territorial gains and whether that changes your approach? And then also with the president of Ukraine calling for a swift end to this conflict by winter. Is there a military solution to this conflict? And if not, what is the administration doing to reach a negotiated settlement? Could this happen in the G20? Who's involved? Can you lay out any sort of roadmap?
Well, as the president has said, to your last question first, as the president has said many times, no conversation about Ukraine without Ukraine. What we have been trying to do and have been doing for the past several months is to make sure that we put, with our assistance that we have been providing, make sure we put Ukraine in the most strongest kind of position. So when there is that opportunity to do those negotiations, they're able to do that. But what we have seen from President Putin is he is not in a place or has no desire to negotiate. So going to your first question now is our approach has not changed. We are going to continue to support Ukraine. We're going to continue to help Ukraine fight for their democracy, fight for their territorial integrity. And, and then to your second question, going to the second one, we have said for months that the fighting in the Donbass, which is where I think you're speaking about, could be prolonged and protracted. That is something that we have been saying for some time, and we would see with gains and with losses on both sides. We're seeing that today, as you just laid out, but that doesn't mean that the Russians have been able to achieve with their goals, and doesn't mean that the Ukrainians have stopped fighting. They have shown their bravery. They will continue to fight and fight for their democracy, and so we will continue to support Ukraine. We have given them the most amount of support than any other country as it relates to security assistance, and that is not going to stop. Okay.
Thank you, Karen. I would like to ask you about the announcement that the president made at the G7 for the Global Partnership on Infrastructure. But before that, I would like to know what's the difference between President Trump watching TV, even pleading to go to the Capitol while the Capitol was being attacked, and President Biden going to the beach and having fun while Supreme Court justices are under attack by a verbally violent mob. What's the difference between those two leaders?
Wait, what's the comparison you're making? Could you say the first part?
So I'm saying that what's the difference between President Trump not doing anything while the Capitol was being attacked and President Biden not doing anything while protesters, while the Supreme Court justices were under attack in their own homes with their families and with their children?
Well, there are two major differences here. First of all, our predecessor was very, we have said that his behavior on that day, on January 6th, was atrocious. The president has said that. And we are going to let the select committee, the January 6th select committee, continue to do their independent review of that, their hearing. And you guys all saw for yourselves. The American people have seen for themselves what our predecessor has done, his behavior and his involvement. So that is not the same. That is absolutely not the same. We are talking about what we saw on January 6th. We are talking about an attack on our democracy. We are talking about a very dark day that the person who was here before us, seemingly, if you watch, was very involved. So that's very, very different. Now, fast forward to this president. This president is fighting for women's rights. He's fighting for women's freedom. He has spoken out. He's been very clear about what needs to happen next. He put out 2 executive authorities that lays out ways that we can protect women. He has said that everything is on the table. We're going to see what else we can do. But he has spoken very truthfully and very honestly with the American people, which is if we want to see Roe become the law of the land, we also have to act. We have to hold Congress accountable and make sure that they act. And if that cannot happen, then Americans need to go to the ballot box. And that is very different. And to say that there is no difference, that is just unbelievably wrong.
But is it concerned that Supreme Court justice
I'm moving on. Go ahead, Phil. Go ahead. Hold on. Go ahead, Phil. And then I'll come back to you, Emily.
Thank you. I've got a policy question about some of the oil that was released from the Strategic National Petroleum Reserve. But first, a follow-up. We have all heard it. The president likes to say, I will always level with you. He says that again and again. Moments ago, though, you seemed to dismiss Peter's question about his conversation with his son, Hunter Biden, with regards to his business dealings. And I'm wondering, how is that silence consistent with the president's promise to always level with the American public? Because, in public he says he hasn't discussed these business dealings. And then, at least according to the voicemail that's been obtained by the Daily Mail and the Washington Examiner, it certainly seems like he was seeking to do exactly that, have a conversation about these business dealings. Is he leveling with the American public on this?
Phil, I hear your question, but what I can tell you from here, standing at this podium, is that I cannot comment on any materials from the laptop. And I would refer you to the representatives of Hunter Biden. That's what I can share with you at this podium at this time.
And then there's a Reuters report out this morning that says that more than 5 million barrels of oil that were released from the emergency oil reserves were exported to Europe and Asia last month, and some of it reportedly was actually heading to China. Is the administration aware of those reports? And does the president mind that some of this oil that was meant to ease pain for consumers is headed overseas?
I have not seen that report, so I would honestly have to go look into it and see what the truth is in that statement that you just laid out, and see exactly what's happening. I just have not seen that report. Go ahead, Ed.
Yeah,
I'm so sorry. And then Ebony. I'm so sorry. I was supposed to go to Ebony, but you go quickly, and then we'll go to Ebony.
Yeah. The Atlanta Fed GDP Now tracker is showing that the second quarter, it's estimating second quarter's negative growth, 2.1%. Should that hold, the U.S. has been in recession for the first half of this year. Does the president believe that we are in a recession, first of all? Second of all, if that does hold, does the president accept responsibility for his policies as part of that?
So first, do we believe we're in recession? No. That's my answer to you on that. So there is a nonpartisan data that came out recently, the National Bureau of Economic Research, which I'm sure you know very well, Ed. It determines and defines recession. And so let me just quote here for a second. In recent decades, the two measures we have put the most weight on are real personal income less transfer and non-farm payroll employment. So that is from the nonpartisan National Bureau of Economics Research. Again, determines the definition of recession. So here are the facts. The facts are this. We've averaged more than 400,000 jobs every month for the past, over the last month, 3 months. We've held steady that 3.6 unemployment rate. Consumer spending remains strong and above pre-pandemic trends. Business investment remains strong, and household balance sheets remain strong. So we do not believe that we are in a recession, and we have a nonpartisan entity to speak to that more directly and more specifically.
One more quick one. At the G7, there's video of the French president running up to President Biden and relaying a message saying that the Saudis are about at capacity through the UAE. Did President Biden ask the French to ask the Saudis to pump more oil through the UAE?
I did not hear this conversation, so I can't speak to that conversation either. But what I can say is, as we know, the early week of June, the OPEC Plus announced that they were going to increase their capacity for July and August by 50%. So I will leave that there. And I think that says a lot about where they are with their capacity. And of course, we welcome that. But again, I'll leave it to OPEC Plus to speak to that. Go ahead, Ebony. I know I promised you a question.
Two quick questions. One on gun reform. Is there anything or any consideration that the administration can do when it comes to regulating military-style ammunition, whether that be in production? Is there anything that the Fed can do to move in that capacity? Since you're not getting anywhere with on guns, what about ammunition? Any talks?
So we believe that the best way to really have a comprehensive gun reform is through legislation, is through work with Congress. As it comes to the federal level, the president has done the most executive action than any president at this time in their administration. And so now what we are going to continue to do and continue to focus on is to work with Congress to do more. And one of the things that I've just been pointing out is the banning of assault weapons, which we believe is incredibly important, as the president led on this issue back in 1994. We're going to think.
Second question, really quickly.
Sure.
The Senate recesses in August. A lot of the president's efforts on criminal justice basically have stalled, but I want to ask about the Equal Act legislation to end the disparity between crack and powder cocaine. The House passed the bill last September, overwhelming bipartisan support. Is the president leaning in at all on lawmakers to get this bill to him?
So I have to talk to our Office of Leg Affairs on that. I do not know where that legislation is currently. I don't know if it went over to the Senate. I don't know where the mechanics are on that. But happy to take that question to you in the back. No, we got to go, guys. Thank you. We'll be back. Well, hopefully we'll see you in Ohio tomorrow.
The world of mercenaries, it's an illicit economy. I think this could be one of the biggest insecurity threats of the 21st century.
Over 100 states worldwide are using military drones, and that number is growing significantly.
I would say hypersonic missiles of various kinds are kind of the poster child of this new era of missile warfare. And we're going to have to find ways to contend with that.
Armed, unmanned, and high-tech, drones, or remotely piloted aircraft, are becoming a ubiquitous battlefield presence.
And frankly, I think we're in the middle of an underground drone arms race.
And larger drones, like the MQ-9 Reaper, as well as medium-sized drones, such as the Turkish TB2 and the Chinese Winglong 2, have become a must-have item for militaries worldwide.
At the moment, we see like over 100 states worldwide are using military drones, and that number is growing significantly.
In Libya, Nagorno-Karabakh, and during the US's global war on terror, armed drones have been active across the globe. These drones can fly thousands of feet high and rain down destruction with pinpoint accuracy with little warning. But who makes these high-tech weapons of war?
It is not very easy to develop armed drones, but it also is not quite as difficult as, say, developing nuclear weapons.
And who is buying them? Drone technology isn't that new. During World War II, the US remotely piloted a B-17 as part of a test program, and during the Cold War, drones were used to spy on other countries. The SR-71 even had a rocket-powered drone that it could deploy in flight to take photos to be retrieved later.
Drones date back much longer to early flight, but like the modern drones basically trace their origin to the 80s.
The convergence of satellite technology, composites, and computer miniaturization allowed for the rise of drones like the General Atomics MQ-1 Predator. General Atomics, which includes GA Aeronautical Systems Inc., are one of the leading producers of unmanned systems in the world. They currently produce the MQ-9 Reaper as well as the naval version, the Sea Guardian, among other unmanned systems. In the 2000s, the Predator was armed with missiles, which quietly started a new arms race. It had the ability to stay overhead for long periods of time, and it could be controlled by a ground station in another country. The drone became the face of US conflicts in the Middle East. And moral and legal questions about drone use rose from the targeted killing campaigns that the US operates to this day. In 2001, the MQ-9 Reaper made its first flight, and eventually became the dominant armed drone that the US fielded. The Reaper has a payload of 3,850 pounds, which compares to the Predator's 450 pounds. This means it can carry far more missiles or bombs than the Predator, among other advantages. But what will eventually replace the hundreds of Reaper drones has yet to be revealed. One current General Atomics aeronautical project, as seen in this General Atomics video, is the Avenger. The US military has not adopted the Avenger for frontline service. The advanced drone is designed to be stealthy and survivable against modern air defenses, which could make it a window into what the drone of the future will look like that replaces the MQ-9.
The US government, the US military will never fight another war without drone technology ever again. But unfortunately, I feel like as a whole, we are no longer have the advantage.
Countries around the world have taken notice of the investment the US is pouring into larger drones and have made efforts to buy these game-changing drones themselves. The US has been judicious about what countries it allows General Atomics to sell to.
We have put too much of an emphasis on restricting exports to countries that are in need of this technology, countries that are friendly to us, because we've wanted to maintain that airspace dominance.
The MQ-9 requires a ground station, satellite links, and maintenance for its high-tech hardware and software. And this means the MQ-9's ballooning price point of around $32 million has dissuaded some prospective buyers. Allies like Australia have shown interest in buying the MQ-9B, and the US State Department cleared a $1.6 billion deal in late April for 12 Sky Guardians and all associated equipment. But the demand for more affordable drones hasn't subsided, leading to others filling the needs of the market.
What's interesting to note is that for many years, about a decade or so, the US and Israel basically had a monopoly over more sophisticated armed drone systems, and neither of them were really keen on exporting.
Israel was one of the earliest adopters of drone technology, and also one of the first exporters. However, these exported drones are generally unarmed, making them less useful against military targets.
Partly because there was this almost export ban, a number of other actors started to develop their own domestic armed drones, most notably China and Turkey.
China's Chengdu Aircraft Industry Group has produced the Winglong series of drones. The price point of the Winglong 2, which runs an estimated $1 to $2 million, has made it a popular addition to militaries in Africa and the Middle East. Russia is likely to try to eventually export its homegrown Orion drone. And Turkey, which has made a strong push in recent decades to build an aerospace industry, has produced one of the most infamous medium-sized drones. The Baykar Defense-produced TB2, which is controlled by line of sight, has made an impact in Nagorno-Karabakh and in Libya. Several countries, including Ukraine, which signed a $69 million contract for armed TB2s in 2019, have ordered the Turkish drone. And more potential buyers could be wooed by the highlight reel of the TB2 taking out modern tanks in real-world situations. These highlight reels of destruction haven't been all upside for the new entry to the armed drone market. Some armed drones have been regulated as missiles under international law.
I think our policymakers need to adapt the policy for the 21st century and understand that there's many different actors using drone technology, and they're using them in different ways.
The Missile Technology Control Regime, or MTCR, restricts the export of missiles capable of carrying a 500 kilogram payload at least 300 kilometers. This is why drones are considered missiles under the MTCR. The US has previously limited what drones can be sold to other countries due to the MTCR.
Sort of the big drone export news changed last summer when the Trump administration decided to loosen some restrictions on what the United States could export. The Biden administration has so far upheld that relaxed restriction.
Canada and Germany are two countries that have banned the export of key materials used to make armed drones, in Turkey and Iran, respectively.
In the end, drones are just, model airplanes with great sensors on them. And all of these are, dual use and used in the civilian realm. And in fact, the drones have risen enormously in the civilian realm over the last 5 to 10 years. And so controlling their export is really difficult. And I would also note that it is not that difficult to develop these systems.
What happens when everyone can buy a quadcopter or a fixed-wing drone for a couple $100?
Some manufacturers of non-military drones have put in safeguards, like geofencing, to prevent drones from being weaponized. Geofencing is a preset limitation on where a drone can be flown. Airports are commonly fenced off to prevent drones from interfering with airport operations.
Civilian drones can also be used for all kind of really helpful applications, from agricultural use to checks and controls, etc. So how do you control those kind of things?
There are also concerns about the ethical problems with using armed drones.
So, for example, the large-scale drone campaign started by Bush and expanded under Obama. We saw the increased use of armed drones for targeted executions and increasing numbers of civilians who were killed in those kind of operations, who didn't have any access to accountability and reparations because technically the program didn't exist.
Large armed drones aren't going away. Baykar is working on a larger drone called the Akinci, which can be satellite controlled and has a larger payload. China also appears to be working towards fielding a newly developed armed drone. But advances in technology are allowing smaller drones to tackle missions that previously would have only been possible with a larger drone.
So when I see conflicts like what's taking place in Syria, or with Russia starting to use these all over the world, and not even just the type of drones that you would think are multi-million-dollar drones. We're talking about drones that a kid can purchase off of the internet, and anyone that has savvy knowledge of how to turn these things into deadly weapons has the ability, unfortunately these days, to do something bad with it.
Drone swarms are dozens or hundreds of drones operating in unison that can overwhelm defenses. And loitering munitions like the Harap, which is produced in Israel, are blurring the line between cruise missile and drone.
And with regard to these loitering munitions or kamikaze drones or whatever you want to call them, these are primarily at this point produced by Israel. Both are systems that basically go into the air, they loiter for a while, search for a target, and then dive into the target and explode with it. This is why they're called kamikaze drones, because they don't come back. They destroy themselves.
New types of armed drones, potential civilian casualties, and the legal gray area of targeted killings are all issues that the drone industry will need to contend with in the coming years.
The biggest challenge at the moment, how does technology, which is always 2 steps ahead of regulation, how can we ensure that it doesn't get out of hand?
SpaceX, United Launch Alliance, Virgin Orbital. These are the companies you think of when you think of commercial rockets. But another venture involving rocket motors rakes in heaps of cash every year. Missiles are guided rockets, used in war, both defensively and offensively. There are large missiles, small missiles, missiles designed to destroy tanks, missiles designed to take out planes, and just about everything in between, including missiles designed to shoot down other missiles. And they are the number 2 defense export in the US behind aircraft.
The major players in the United States are by far Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, Northrop Grumman. Those would be the top missile sellers in the United States.
Like with aircraft, missile sales are based on international alliances and treaties, and these sales can become hot-button issues, like a recent sale proposal of Boeing Harpoon missiles to Taiwan, or a failed bid to sell the Patriot missile system produced by Raytheon to Turkey. As technology advances, the line between drones and missiles is blurring, and this has the potential to disrupt the entire industry.
I like to say that in some respects, we've entered a kind of new missile age with a really significant global supply and demand signal.
What will the new missile age hold for companies that sell these weapons of war? Raytheon, the producer of the iconic Patriot missile system, is one of the top manufacturers of guided missiles in the world. During a recent missile test by the US Navy, a Raytheon Standard Missile 3, or SM-3, intercepted an intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM.
Shooting down an incoming ballistic missile is a very difficult problem. They move very, very fast, and they tend to be surrounded by debris that's also moving very fast. So you have to hit them quickly, target them quickly, and differentiate between the actual missile and the surrounding debris.
We tested a ship-based interceptor against an ICBM, considerably expanding our capability to defend against those kinds of threats.
That makes the SM-3 a potential deterrent against an ICBM launched by North Korea or Iran.
I think the most important takeaway of the SM-3 to a ICBM intercept is that it increases the reliability and our confidence in it against some really stressing regional threats.
Raytheon introduced cost-saving measures due to the drop in commercial air travel during the COVID-19 pandemic, but its Missile and Defense Division has continued to drive sales and has had an operating profit of $453 million in the third quarter of 2020. American aerospace giant Boeing sells missile systems like the Harpoon. It's also involved in fielding missiles designed to kill ICBMs, like the Ground-Based Midcourse Defense System. Boeing is now competing for the bid to produce the potential Next Generation Interceptor, or NGI. Boeing has pivoted towards defense sales to make up for commercial losses, and has made $6.8 billion in that sector in the third quarter of 2020 alone. Some missiles in the US are designed and built by multiple companies. The Next Generation Interceptor bid from Boeing, for example, also involves General Atomics and Aerojet Rocketdyne. The winner of the Next Generation Interceptor bid could secure $4.9 billion over 5 years from the Pentagon's Missile Defense Agency to build the interceptor of the future. Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman are also bidding on the right to produce the NGI. Northrop Grumman is involved in making rocket motors for many other missiles, including the air-to-air Sidewinder. Northrop Grumman saw its sales increase in the third quarter of 2020 by 7% from 2019, rising to $9.1 billion. General Dynamics is involved in creating warheads and other parts in various missile programs, and Lockheed Martin is also involved in upgrading the missile fired by the Patriot system designed by Raytheon, which is just one more example of how these companies tend to work together on these complex projects. Thanks to the advanced technology used to make these missile systems, all of these companies remain dependent on relationships between the US government and other countries to make international sales. After all, the US needs to trust customers before allowing defense contractors to sell them cutting-edge weaponry. When Turkey fielded fresh bids to buy a new missile system in November of 2013, the Patriot was an assumed frontrunner. But things quickly went off the rails when Turkish demands became too much to make the deal doable.
Turkey's decision to buy the Russian S-400 is probably one of the messiest arms deals that's ever gone down in history. Turkey wanted to buy the United States Raytheon's Patriot system. The United States passed a couple of years in a row, and Russia scooped up to pick up Turkey and sell them the S-400.
The failure of Raytheon's reported $3.5 billion bid also affected relations between the US and Turkey. The manufacturing for some components of the F-35, the cutting-edge American stealth fighter jet from Lockheed, are being moved out of the country to other F-35 partner states. Russian and Chinese companies also sell advanced missiles in all categories, and are always looking to enlarge their market share and compete with American offerings in countries that are on the fence about who to buy from. In the case of Russia, the US has pushed back on Russian missile sales with the threat of sanctions. But the political ramifications of missile sales can cut both ways.
China will regard any future arms sales to Taiwan as highly provocative. And if there's anything we know about the incoming administration's policy towards China, it will remain fundamentally on a competitive footing, but the administration won't be looking to simply poke China in the eye in the way that the Trump administration has. So it is very possible that we could see a calibration for some of these sales. They could be rolled back, they could be modified, they could be shrunk.
Taiwan and some of its neighbors have really been getting into the missile game. They've been doing it for many years, but in the past couple months and really this past year, some pretty significant sales have been authorized, especially in the anti-ship missile category.
In Taiwan's case, its major threat on an operational level is a Chinese invasion fleet, ships crossing the Taiwan Strait. And if Taiwan can find some way to threaten those ships, threaten to wipe out the invasion force, then it can solve its strategic problem, even if it can't match China's spending and the size of China's other military forces.
The incoming Biden administration could handle arms sales differently than the Trump administration has. As of now, Taiwan plans on buying 400 Harpoon defense systems from Boeing for $2.37 billion, a hefty investment in missile technology. But as technology advances, could giant purchases like this one be rendered useless by newcomers to the guided weapon world? In the US, the design, production, and sales of missiles employ thousands of people across almost every state.
The reason why all these defense companies see such bipartisan support is because they don't necessarily headquarter at one place. They spread the wealth. So they have depots, maintenance facilities, testing centers throughout the United States.
Large missile systems are costly to build and maintain. For example, the US approved of a potential sale of 44 terminal high-altitude area defense systems for an estimated $15 billion to Saudi Arabia in 2019. Even smaller missile systems, like anti-tank missiles or air-to-air missiles, can cost thousands of dollars per missile, or millions of dollars per unit when all costs such as research and development are factored in. The US sale of 210 Javelin anti-tank missiles and 37 launchers for $47 million to Ukraine in 2019 is an example of the cost involved even in smaller missiles. Advances in guided weapons, such as low-cost cruise missiles or even suicide drones, which can fly almost undetected and destroy targets defended with expensive air defenses, are changing the game.
We can look at the attack last year by or suspected attack by the Houthis on Saudi oil facilities, where Saudi Arabia's Patriot missile defenses couldn't do anything against these low-flying drones that basically exploded on impact and caused massive damage. Countries including Iran, a number of other countries around the world, North Korea, have increasingly precise military capabilities. We, of course, earlier this year, after the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian general, saw Iran launch strikes against U.S. military facilities and actually strike with pinpoint accuracy.
The U.S. has invested billions into missile defense technology since the 1980s. It remains to be seen whether current systems can actually intercept ICBM launches in a real-world scenario.
The best defense against a nuclear-tipped ICBM, which is a annihilation level weapon, right? I mean, that's the kind of weapon, if you fire one, you're going to get one shot back at you, back and forth until all of human civilization has been destroyed. So anyway, that's the ICBM, and it's an existential problem for all of us. But you don't defeat the problem of ICBMs and more broadly the problem of nuclear weapons by having the ability to shoot down a few of them, maybe, if you're lucky, at great cost.
These challenges, I think, are here to stay. The genie of missile proliferation is going to be very difficult to reverse. In fact, the best tool we have today really seems to be non-binding export control regimes, where states commit on a unilateral basis not to sell missiles to countries that shouldn't have them, or really any countries at all, to prevent the proliferation of this technology more broadly.
So air defenses are always scarier on paper than they are in practice because there are a lot of practical limitations to their use. Terrain, communications networks that might be fragile, sensor networks that also might be fragile. These things just don't work as well in the real world as they do in simulations or in, PR copy. So, and that probably applies even more so to Russian-made systems than to Western systems.
The new missile age has seen the rise of hypersonic glide vehicles as possible game changers.
I would say hypersonic missiles of various kinds are kind of the poster child of this new era of missile warfare. And we're going to have to find ways to contend with that.
The incoming Biden administration may take a stronger look at alliances and who's getting what systems, and maybe playing a little bit more of a diplomatic role instead of trying to rack up and boost arms sales.
In December 2019, former Nissan CEO Carlos Ghosn made his dramatic escape from Japan. He allegedly had some help from a former U.S. Green Beret and his son. Michael Taylor, a former Green Beret, and his son smuggled him out of Japan in a music equipment box. And more recently, a company based out of Florida named Silvercore USA launched an ill-fated coup attempt in South America. It was a poorly planned attempt to overthrow the embattled president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro. In Seattle, a television crew's protective detail disarmed protesters who had gained access to abandoned police firearms on May 30th, 2020, amid a wave of protests after the death of George Floyd.
He was contracted by one of the news networks out there for private security. He did 4 years in the Marine Corps, and then after doing his 4 years in the Marine Corps, he ended up getting into private military contracting.
Private security is expected to grow to an $81 billion industry by 2023, and that's just in the United States. There exists a higher risk, higher reward sector that attracts people with a unique and expensive skill set only acquired through military experience. Some of these jobs are word of mouth, others are hiding in plain sight on employer websites and job boards. Sites like Shooter Jobs cater to private security roles, and the compensation is highly competitive.
Think of it as like Delta Airlines. You get started as a U.S. Air Force pilot, and then when you leave, you go to Delta. So it's a kind of a crass analogy. But it's the world of mercenaries. It's an illicit economy.
Some of these individuals are part of what are known as private security companies, or private military companies, better known as PMCs.
Private military company is a term of art that is code for mercenary.
They are profit-driven and strive to show value and efficiency to their clients just like any other company. They can provide executive protection, training expertise for other security agencies, companies, or government clients. Their heavily armed employees can be seen at U.S. embassies, on cargo ships traversing dangerous seas, or even training soldiers and police in foreign nations. Although there are numerous companies in the U.S. that provide these services, there are other nations such as Russia that have their own PMCs. One Russian PMC, the Wagner Group, gained notoriety in Syria and was involved in a clash with U.S. forces in 2018.
Russia's private security industry has grown in leaps and bounds over the last couple of decades.
I mean, mercenaries are the second oldest profession. Machiavelli knew how to use and fight with mercenaries. We at war colleges, we don't even study them. The intelligence community does not collect on them. I think this could be one of the biggest insecurity threats of the 21st century, and it's unfortunate that not more is known about it.
After 9/11, the U.S. found itself embroiled in two major conflicts, one in Afghanistan and one in Iraq. Following the initial invasions, there was a need for more manpower to train the new security forces in both countries. The U.S. military is an all-volunteer force, which means rapidly increasing the size of the military would require conscription, also known as the draft, which was notably used during World War II and Vietnam. One answer was to have the private sector fill the gap instead.
There are some people like that, just doing it for the money, but actually, there's all sorts of strange people out there doing it. Some are doing it for the money, some people are doing it for the adventure, and some people were, they're vets of Iraq, Afghanistan, other wars. They come back home, they find out they don't want to be a Walmart, checkout guy or gal, and so they go back to what they know.
The free market rapidly reacted to the profit potential of the massive government contracts to provide a myriad of services, including private security and protective services details.
I know specifically for guys coming out of the special operations background, there's some, fairly lucrative contracts that can be had if you have the right skill sets.
At the height of the Iraq War, there was one contractor to every military service member deployed. The ratio is now 5 contractors to every 1 U.S. soldier. Not all of these are security roles. Contractors do everything from laundry to electrical work to construction. During the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, companies such as Blackwater, Triple Canopy, and DynCorp were responsible for fielding heavily armed and trained employees, and also recruiting and organizing security contractors from a multitude of nations such as Chile, Peru, and Uganda. Recently, even as the U.S. military footprint in the Middle East and Central Asia has diminished, spending on contractors has increased. The Pentagon spent $370 billion on contracting services in 2019. That's $164 billion higher than what was spent on contractors in 2001. According to a new study from Brown and Boston universities, about 53,000 U.S. contractors were stationed in the Middle East in 2019, compared with about 35,000 U.S. troops.
Day rates were $1,000, $1,200 a day and up for certain people. And so they were getting insane amounts of money and then living like that money was a career, right? And now all of a sudden it's like you've got some time in the military under your belt and maybe your marriage is already stressed. And now you're doing this contracting thing where you say, I'm just going to go make some good money. But now you bought a house, you bought a couple cars, you bought some toys. And now you're relying on continuing to do these contracts to pay those bills. And it becomes this cycle that you can't really escape.
Privately hired security is one of the world's oldest professions, and although there are an estimated 1.8 million people working security jobs in the US alone, the efforts of private security companies are notably different than your average mall cop. The landscape of the private security industry in the US is constantly shifting. The firm formerly known as Blackwater, now known as Academy, merged with its competitor Triple Canopy in 2014 to form the Constellus Group. The Constellus Group was bought by a private equity firm, Apollo Global Management, for around $1 billion. These private security companies tend to employ former military, usually with infantry or special operations backgrounds, to take on higher risk, higher reward opportunities. The employees of these companies at times can be teaching foreign military clients, such as the Iraqi military, or protecting a client, such as the contractors who defended the U.S. Embassy in Iraq after the assassination of the Iranian general Qasem Soleimani in early 2020. They can also be used in personal protective roles, like protecting State Department employees. However, recent examples of private security companies, such as Silvercore USA, are prime examples of what can go wrong in this conflict-driven industry. Silvercore USA started as a firm focused on executive protection and school shooter prevention, staffed by former special operations troops. Eventually, the company attempted to overthrow the Maduro regime in Venezuela, resulting in 2 employees, both former Green Berets, being captured during the ill-fated coup attempt.
Not surprising to me that particular company dabbled in other aspects of security. I think that they saw this as their potential big fish, and like a lot of other kind of, get-rich-quick schemes, it's sometimes too good to be true. And I think that maybe this was one of those scenarios where it was just a little bit too good to be true, and it was a little bit more complicated than maybe what initially met the eye.
Another example of the unforeseen consequences involves the rise of the Wagner Group, a private military company based in Russia.
The Wagner Group is a Russian private military company, okay? They're like Blackwater, but much more lethal, and they have a lot more free hand. They work for the GRU, which is Russia's military intelligence directorate.
This private military company has been employed in Syria and Africa. Foreign affairs experts have accused Russia of using the Wagner Group to further its own goals overseas. On February 7, 2018, a group of pro-regime Syrian forces, including Russian mercenaries from the Wagner Group, launched an attack on U.S. forces that included tanks and armored vehicles. U.S. forces fought off the attackers in a 4-hour battle, leaving hundreds of pro-regime casualties. The Wagner Group is central to one theory behind the ongoing controversy around Russia paying Taliban insurgents to kill U.S. troops. One reason for the bounties could be revenge for the Wagner Group mercenaries killed by U.S. forces in Syria in 2018.
I think it's important to keep in mind that it's not easy to connect the dots in a straight line from the U.S. strike on a so-called Wagner contingent in February 2018 in Syria and what's happening today in Afghanistan. It's just a regional reality that Russia will always have a stake in the outcomes in Afghanistan. What is significant here is the escalation up the ladder toward confrontation.
For the first decade after 9/11, the US was the primary customer for private security companies. However, as the US has diminished its role in the Middle East, other countries have shown a desire for private security companies to provide training, security, and in some cases, direct action in war zones.
I think the era of Blackwater and Triple Canopy and DynCorp and Aegis, I think that is a bygone era. There might be something like that in the future, but these companies were big, they were upfront.
The US military has invested in human capital, and the experience that Special Operations Forces have gained in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan holds a unique value in the world market. In the United Arab Emirates, some former US Special Operations soldiers were recruited to provide training for the UAE military, only to then find themselves in the legally precarious situation of providing direct military aid to a foreign government. In Libya, Russia's Wagner Group has been active in supporting the Libyan National Army commander Khalifa Haftar. As Wagner expands operations, US firms have faced a much more austere period of government contracts.
Because I think companies also learned that that was not a money-making adventure for them. The headline risk was simply too much. It got them in too much trouble. And we're seeing like Constellus Group, which bought Triple Canopy, which bought Blackwater, they're like basically in default right now.
The rise of private security companies fighting in hotspots across Africa, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe has shown that other countries and private entities have recognized the value of hiring well-trained and well-armed security forces to perform tasks that otherwise would not be accomplished.
So like China, people have been saying for a long time, like, well, watch that space. When China moves into private military companies, it'll be big because they have the largest domestic security guard business in the world, However, Chinese, it's one thing to be like a Wackenhut mall guard and a mercenary. That's one difference. The second is that China has they're not battle tested, unlike, say, the Russian military or the American military. So it's not like they have a huge core of hardcore vets that they can deploy. And they also tend to deploy their own Chinese military in Africa just under a different, sort of like not little green men, but little, red men or something like that. So they don't really use that model.
Eric Prince, the former CEO of Blackwater, is attempting to break into the Chinese private security market with Frontier Services Group, a security company based out of Hong Kong which aims to provide training to Chinese clients. Prince declined CNBC's request for an interview. Meanwhile, the Wagner Group in Russia continues to expand its footprint in Libya and the Central African Republic.
But what we found, interestingly, is that the majority of folks that we found in our data who sign up to become private security contractors in Russia are cycling through units in the western and southern military districts, which, is known for its counterterrorism sort of orientation, but also has a lot of these units that were transitioned to contract units, essentially. And so they're cycling on and off, it seems, between different terms of service. This is kind of a stopgap Band-Aid solution for Russia's challenges with mobilizing defense.
Nations in the Middle East have continued to hire private security companies to train and augment their own security services.
We're seeing ex-Navy SEALs, ex-Green Berets in Yemen fighting for Middle Eastern monarchies. We're going to see more of that. And I think like the Silver Corps in Venezuela.
I think that there's a lot of entrepreneurs, specifically veteran entrepreneurs, that are kind of trying to find their way. And I think that's what happens with a lot of these guys that have these startup personal security companies where it's like, hey, we need to bring money in somehow. We'll kind of take what we can get contract wise. So one day that might be executive protection. Another day that might be, at a rally or something like that. And then, oh, hey, our name got floated around in the right circle. And now we're, staging a coup in Venezuela.
Since these videos aired, Russia conducted a large-scale invasion of Ukraine. During this conflict, there have been armed drones operated by both sides. Private mercenaries have been allegedly recruited by Russia to fight in Ukraine, and international volunteers have gone on to fight for Ukraine. High-tech missiles ranging from anti-tank missiles, surface-to-air missiles, both man-portable and large mobile systems, and even ballistic missiles and hypersonic missiles have been used in the conflict. The future of war isn't around the corner. It is going on today in conflicts like Ukraine and in other hotspots around the world.
All right. Okay, today my guest will be the Food and Agricultural Organization's chief economist, Maximo Torero, who has been a guest at the briefing previously, and Ronald Tranbahui, WFP's Deputy Director for Research, Assessment, and Monitoring Division. They will be here to talk about the launch of the State of the Food Security and Nutrition in the World. This is the annual flagship report by the food agencies to inform on progress towards ending hunger, achieving food security, and improving nutrition. This year's edition focuses on repurposing food and agricultural policies to make healthy diets more affordable. Quick announcement for you on Thursday, starting Thursday afternoon and all day, most of the day on Friday, the United Nations and the European Commission will hold their first high-level dialogue, and that will take place at the Green Tree Foundation, just outside New York City. The discussions will be co-chaired by the Secretary General and the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. This high-level dialogue will explore avenues for the UN and the European Union for strengthening multilateralism, international cooperation, and partnerships. Throughout several sessions, participants will discuss a number of key challenges facing the international community and how these can best be addressed through increased multilateral cooperation. This includes peace and security, climate emergency, human rights, digital cooperation, as well as the global economic situation and the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. The delegations will also discuss the war in Ukraine and its global consequences, including efforts to alleviate the impact, especially on the most vulnerable, on the food, energy, and finance sectors. You will have seen that in a statement we issued earlier this morning, the Secretary General strongly condemned yesterday's attack due to an improvised explosive device against a convoy of the UN mission in Mali. As we mentioned to you yesterday, 2 Egyptian peacekeepers were killed. The latest number of injured is now 9. And the attack took place about 62 kilometers northeast of Gao in northern Mali. The Secretary General expressed his deepest condolences to the families of the victims, as well as to the government and people of Egypt, whose soldiers continue to pay the highest price in the service of peace in Mali. He recalled that attacks targeting UN peacekeepers may constitute war crimes under international law and called on the transitional authorities in Mali to spare no efforts in identifying the perpetrators of the attack and swiftly bring him to justice. The Secretary General also paid tribute to the peacekeepers of the UN mission in Mali, who with exemplary determination and courage continue to implement their mandate in extremely challenging circumstances in support of the people of Mali. Moving slightly further east to the Central African Republic, our peacekeeping colleagues there tell us that the mission has intervened to protect civilians caught up in clashes between the Central African Republic Armed Forces and the Union for Peace, UPC rebel group, and that is taking place in the Basse-Koto prefecture. The violence erupted following an attack on an armed forces base in Dimbi, which forced more than 500 civilians to flee to a nearby school where the peacekeepers provided protection. The mission also used heavy machine guns to repel the assailants from the town. The situation is now reported to be calm, although peacekeepers remain in position and reinforcements were sent to ensure that security is maintained. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the UN's Joint Human Rights Office has just released its monthly report. It documents an overall 8% increase in abuses and violations in May compared to the previous month, that would be April, with 2/3 of cases attributable to armed groups and 1/3 to state agents. Of deep concern is a sharp rise compared to April in conflict-related sexual violence, with 89 women reportedly impacted. That's a 117% increase. Armed combatants were identified as the main perpetrators, and state actors were also responsible for some of the incidents. our mission there. MONUSCO is continuing to closely work with local authorities to prevent and respond to human rights abuses and violations, and to support its good offices and technical assistance to support prosecution of perpetrators, to contribute to an end to impunity. On Somalia, our humanitarian colleagues are telling us that due to the drought, it is believed that there will be famine in 8 areas of the country by September. More than 200,000 men, women, and children are experiencing catastrophic levels of food insecurity for the first time since 2017, and food security will likely not improve until the middle of next year. Our humanitarian colleagues warn that more than 7 million people are already impacted by the severe drought, up from nearly 6 million in May. More than 800,000 have left their homes in search of food, water, and pasture. At least 200 children have died of malnutrition and disease since January. An estimated 1.5 million children under the age of 5 face acute malnutrition. Late last month, our partners launched the Drought Respond and Famine Prevention Plan to provide life-saving assistance and prevent famine in Somalia. The plan calls for nearly $1 billion to reach 6.4 million people through the end of the year. Separately, the Humanitarian Response Plan for Somalia, which calls for $1.46 billion to help 5.5 million people, is only 30% funded as of today. With nearly 4 million people having received assistance since January, we need much more cash and resources to meet the growing needs and avert a famine. From Afghanistan, 27,000 people have now been displaced following the recent fighting in the district of Balkabab in the Sar-Erpul province in the northern part of the country. Our partners are preparing to provide food and other supplies to more than 10,000 people in Balkab. Our humanitarian colleagues tell us that families have fled to neighboring provinces in the north and to Bamiyan province in the central highlands. In Bamiyan, UN teams said there are more than 6,000 internally displaced people, and we, along with our local partners, are providing people with food, healthcare, educational, psychosocial support, as well as cash assistance and other supplies. Also in Afghanistan today, flash floods were reported in Logar, Ghazni, Paktia, Maidan, Wandak provinces. Initial reports indicate that the recent flash floods killed 6 people, damaged hundreds of homes, and destroyed agricultural lands. We are working with our partners to carry an assessment in Logar province that will take place tomorrow to see exactly what the needs are going to be. A quick update from Sri Lanka, where our colleagues at the World Food Programme today said that 3 in 10 households are food insecure, according to its latest food security assessment. Food inflation is alarmingly high. This month, there was a 57% increase in food prices, which has crippled the population's ability to put sufficient and nutritious food on the table. 3 million people are now set to receive emergency food, nutrition, and school meals from WFP until December. WFP is prioritizing families who are unable to purchase increasingly expensive food, particularly those with children under 5, pregnant and lactating women, persons with disabilities. This support will be delivered through in-kind food, cash-based transfers, school meals, and nutritional support. Already, WFP has distributed 2,100 vouchers to pregnant women in Sri Lanka. This morning, the Economic and Social Council's high-level political forum focused on Sustainable Development Goal number 4, which is quality education and linkages and co-benefits with other goals. This session explored lessons learned during the COVID-19 crisis and how responses can be directed towards the provision of quality education and lifelong learning for everyone. It is also considered how innovation in learning that emerged during the crisis, including through digital technologies, can boost access and quality rather than worsen inequalities. This morning also included a short session on how to bolster local action to build back better from COVID-19 and support local authorities in the implementation of the SDGs. Today, our friends at the UN Department of Global Communications launched a new initiative called Football for the Goals. This provides a platform to mobilize the global football community to champion action around achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. The initiatives will tap into the power of football to raise the profile of the SDGs and will drive behavioral change and sustainable practices in the football industry. Football for the Goals, in recognition of SDG number 5, gender equality, was launched on the opening day of UEFA's Women's Euro 2022, which is taking place in the UK, with a conversation featuring our Deputy Secretary General, Mina Mohammed, UEFA's President Alexander Cheferin, and that was moderated by Melissa Fleming. Having recently unveiled its own sustainability strategy entitled Strength Through Unity, which focuses on human rights and the environment, UEFA joins the initiative as its inaugural member. The full conversation is available, and if any of you are interested in that story, please let us know. There are a number of people in DGC who can be interviewed. UEFA, UEFA. How would you pronounce it? What did I say? What did you say? Jeez, well, it must be great being a native. It must be fantastic being a native English speaker. Yeah. Jesus. All right. Any more comments? Okay. Let's go to another native English speaker. Go ahead, James.
Sorry, no, it's just a simple follow-up, actually, on one of the things you mentioned, this meeting between the Ursula von der Leyen and the Secretary General at Green Tree. What press arrangements are there?
There will be a photo spray which we'll distribute. We will not have outside.
So no stakeout?
No, they may say a few words to UNTV without, and we'll send that to you. But
so in other words, no press engagement, because if it's UNTV and we're not there, it's statements, not press involvement.
I agree with your taxonomy. Yes, Madame.
As you may know, Belgian lawmakers give initial clearance today to a prisoner exchange with Iran that could lead to release of an Iranian diplomat convicted of planning to bomb a rally of an exiled opposition group. What is the United Nations stand on this? And don't you think that is going to give Islamic Republic of Iran the leverage to take more hostages to...
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yes. Europeans or American hostages to just take, use them as a tool in...
I was not aware of this story. Frankly, it seems to me like a bilateral issue on which I have no comment at this point. Betul.
Thanks, Steph. As you said, the UN has just announced this report on global hunger. And given the numbers, how urgent is it for the UN to have this agreement on the Ukraine grain deal? And has there been any progress? What is the obstacle? Is it the Russians? Is it the Ukrainians? Can you tell us what's happening with the deal?
The discussions are continuing, and you are right to point out the fact that this war is having an impact on global hunger, not just in terms of people's ability to get grain, but the grain that we need to go to market is also animal feed, and obviously fertilizers are essential for the obvious reasons. I'm not going to go into details of what may be the sticking points in the discussion. Madame Linda.
Thank you, staff. My question follows up on this issue. How much of a given restrictions on Ukrainian and Russian wheat and food, how is the UN making up any shortfall? In other words, where is the UN buying food elsewhere, or how is that all working?
This may be a better question for our WFP guest. WFP and others buy grain on the market. So obviously the prices have gone up, so the costs have gone up, which is really the critical part. But obviously they will get the grain they need wherever they can get it. But there's less on the market, the prices go up. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Taliban's defense minister traveled to Doha and met with Qatari officials. What do you know about this trip, and do you think it's part of a negotiation with the West or?
I mean, we are not involved in those discussions. It's obvious that the de facto authorities in Kabul have had discussions with Qatar and others, but it's not something we're involved in. Okay, we'll get our guests and be back in 2 seconds.
Buffalo, Uvalde, Tulsa. New names to add to the list of mass shootings in America. As of June, there were more mass shootings in 2022 than days. The responses, as predictable as the violence itself.
Enough, enough, enough.
Restricting the fundamental human right of law-abiding Americans to defend themselves is not the answer.
Nowhere else do little kids go to school thinking that they might be shot that day.
And every time there's a shooting, we play this ridiculous theater.
It is a fierce fight. Both sides argue with passion, yet their core positions are clear. For some, guns are sacrosanct, part of this country's identity and culture, needed to defend against enemies and tyranny. For others, they are weapons of mass destruction, tearing apart this country one act of violence at a time. Those opposing positions echo the sentiments that we heard in our reporting.
Do you really think that doing nothing is going to solve this problem?
It's really clear, shall not infringe means shall not be infringed at the federal level.
Individuals who aren't armed fall prey to slavery and tyranny.
I'm not taking your rights away. I'm taking your ability to kill a bunch of people.
How has the debate surrounding gun control become so extreme? We're going to take a look at the Second Amendment and the gun lobby's outsized role in American politics. We'll hear how the debate has been co-opted by extreme views, and we'll talk about what most Americans actually think. But we'll start with a mass shooting that set off a cycle of national debate. Columbine, on April 20th, 1999, 2 armed teenagers went on a shooting rampage in the high school library. They killed 12 students and 1 teacher, then killed themselves. Columbine was not the first school shooting, but it changed the national debate after these images were broadcast across the country. This memorial, just beyond school grounds, is a reminder of what happened. There's a plaque for each victim.
So this is Daniel's.
Tom Mauser's son Daniel was killed in the massacre. He was just 15 and had already been worried about gun violence.
It was just 2 weeks before Columbine. He asked me a question at the dinner table. Dad, did you know there were loopholes in the Brady Bill? Brady Bill is the national law that requires background checks for gun purchases. I said, no, I didn't know about that, Daniel. 2 weeks later, he was killed with a gun that was purchased through a loophole in the Brady Bill. How could I not respond to that? I had to.
In the aftermath, Tom joined Colorado Ceasefire, an organization campaigning for common sense gun regulation. They were able to secure measures like universal background checks in the state of Colorado. But on the federal level, Tom says there hasn't been enough action.
What's the alternative here? Really, what the gun lobby is promoting is essentially doing nothing besides putting more guns on the street and making them, open carry, concealed carry, teachers carrying. We've been doing that for decades now, and what has it gotten us?
Other countries have shown very different responses to gun violence. In Scotland in 1996,
a man massacred 16 children and a teacher at a school in the town of Dunblane. The British Parliament banned private ownership of most handguns and semi-automatic weapons. In Australia, just a few weeks later, a man shot dead 35 people at a tourist attraction in Port Arthur, Tasmania. The Australian government quickly restricted semi- and fully automatic weapons. And in New Zealand in 2019, a man attacked 2 mosques in Christchurch, killing 51 people. The government passed a law banning most semi-automatic weapons. Such strong measures look unlikely in the U.S. In Denver, we meet a man who believes in the power of firearm education to make life safer. Anubis Hiru co-founded the 1770 Armory Gun Club. He's a pistol instructor, certified by the National Rifle Association, and a strong believer in the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. But his central focus is teaching people, especially in the Black community, how to use a firearm safely and effectively.
There's people that don't like us because of the color of our skin, and that's pretty much the only reason. Things like Buffalo, things like Dylan Roof, the Charleston church shooting, those things happen. So we can't discount those particular instances to say, hey, this kind of stuff is happening in 2020, 2021, 2022. We can't be blind to that, right? Firearms is something that we can't disinvent or disarm at this point. So we would much rather create a system of education. So these are all training.
There are more than 120 firearms per 100 residents in America, the highest rate in the world. Anubis says guns cannot be taken away, even the kinds often used in massacres.
I have an AR-15 because, number one, it's my right to do so. And number two, because if there's a situation where I need to engage multiple targets, for purposes of self-defense, I can easily do that.
Arms are also necessary for a broader self-defense against the federal government. That's according to Melissa Martz, a lawyer running for Congress in Florida as a MAGA candidate, a Republican linked to former President Trump. She believes there is no room for federal gun control.
When you look at our American history, you look at our Constitution, our founding documents, and you read that Second Amendment, it's really clear, shall not infringed means shall not be infringed at the federal level. And it's not just in this district, it's across party lines, and it's all over, both at state and federal level, where there's a real attack on our ability to protect ourselves against a tyrannical government. There are 2 ways out of our Second Amendment for people that don't like it. They can either change the Constitution, or they can pick from a plethora of countries that do not protect gun rights.
We asked constitutional law expert Daryl Miller about that argument, defense against potential tyranny of the federal government. It harkens back to the founding of the country.
That is, a person that would walk into a court and say, the reason why I have and need this AR-15 is because I have to be able to fend off the United States military, or I have to be able to gun down rogue police officers who are illegally trying to arrest me. That has absolutely no legal purchase in America. So it's mostly a political use of the Second Amendment, not a legal use of the Second Amendment.
The Second Amendment. It's what gun advocates cite as being the source of their right to carry guns. What does it say? A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. It has been interpreted in many ways and often racially tinged, according to Daryl Miller. But it didn't carry much legal impact for most of American history.
What changed in America in particular, beginning in the middle of the 20th century, but really accelerating in the later part of the 20th century, was that the Second Amendment became a really important political organizing tool, especially for conservatives and the Republican Party.
And yet there was one high-profile moment when Republicans moved to curb Second Amendment rights. In the 1960s, the Black Panthers, a black power and self-defense organization, started cop watching, openly carrying guns while monitoring police. They said the Second Amendment gave them the right to defend themselves against police violence. California, under Republican Governor Ronald Reagan, swiftly restricted the right to carry guns in public. Another milestone, the National Rifle Association's 1977 annual convention saw the rise to power of hardline gun rights advocates. They have been in charge of the NRA ever since. And a watershed moment in 2008, the Supreme Court ruled in the District of Columbia versus Heller case that individuals have a right to keep and bear arms for personal purposes. The NRA has been a key proponent of the Second Amendment argument.
From my cold, dead hands.
Their defense of broad liberal gun ownership rests on the fact that the vast majority of gun owners are law-abiding people. In contrast, they say mass shooters are lone, deranged criminals, and they are to blame, not the guns. It's an argument they honed after Columbine and again after the Sandy Hook school massacre in 2012. It's become a familiar refrain, heard everywhere. Over the last few decades, the NRA has established a deep well of support in the halls of power here in Washington. It has been weakened by financial woes and by scandal, but it has strong ties to the Republican Party, and it has benefited from gun rights becoming a core element of conservative identity politics.
Now we're to the place where carrying a firearm in public is a kind of a cultural signifier. It's something that says, oh, I'm this kind of a person, and so therefore you have to treat me in a certain way.
We went to Iowa to meet Amber Gustafson, who ran for state senate a few years ago on a Gun Sense platform. She knocked on thousands of doors and says the vast majority of people agreed with her.
It's getting people to recognize that at any point it could be you. It could be you. And the answer isn't to arm yourself, because people think, oh, that's great, yeah, so somebody could come into the grocery store and shoot it up and I'll just carry a firearm because I'll protect myself. But most people have a wild over-expectation of what they're capable of with their firearm.
Survey after survey shows the majority of Americans want stricter gun control of some kind, things that even go beyond the bipartisan agreement in Washington. Things like universal background checks, stricter gun storage rules for the home, or limiting the size of magazines so they can't take as many bullets. Many gun owners would support such measures. Steve Odson is one of them. He teaches clay pigeon shooting to high school students and is a member of a gun club.
I think common sense, every gun should be locked up. You should be the only one that had the key. Now, my grandkids wouldn't get it. If my grandkids got into it, I know they know how to handle a gun, but most people don't. I should not be allowed to get a pistol permit unless I've gone through a course that shows me how to handle.
Steve says he finds himself walking a difficult line with other gun owners. He's even gotten into arguments with the hardline Second Amendment advocates.
I'm not taking your rights away. I'm taking your ability to kill a bunch of people. But when they started rejecting the idea of background checks, well, that's only common sense.
That was our latest dip into America's culture wars. As we discovered, the country can't seem to reconcile the idea of the right to bear arms with the proposal that limiting that right could save lives. Most Americans want some kind of controls, but what exactly that should look like and who is responsible for that control, that's where it gets tricky. On the national level, the gun lobby has leaned so far into these culture wars, and so many political careers are so invested in gun rights, it appears there's no going back. There has been some movement in both directions. Federal lawmakers reached a bipartisan deal to expand background checks and give states money for red flag laws. It's the first national agreement on guns in nearly 30 years. But in the same week, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of gun rights, saying it was unconstitutional to require people to justify carrying a concealed weapon in public. It seems in America, even when decisions are made on gun control, nothing is ever really agreed.
информации посольства России в Турции, судно в настоящее время находится на рейде порта Карасу и проходит стандартные процедуры, включая фитосанитарный контроль. По итогам турецкими властями будет принято решение о заходе либо отказе на заход в порт. Ни о каком задержании или аресте сухогруза речь не идет.
І ми жодного дня не скорочували і не будемо скорочувати нашу дипломатичну активність, щоб отримати для України сучасні і достатні протиракетні системи. Це завдання максимум для нашої держави вже цього року дати базову безпеку для українців, базовий захист від ракетних ударів.
Ну, мы, в принципе, ведем переговоры таким образом, чтобы нам никогда не было стыдно, если хотите. Мы всегда говорим то, что думаем. И готовы за эти свои слова отвечать и объяснять нашу позицию. Считаю, что дипломатическая этика, конечно, не предполагает вот такой односторонний слив записи.
Futures market punters reckon the cash rate will be 3.5% by May next year. Now, that doesn't mean it will be, but that's the forecast that has real money behind it. And one of the reasons they think borrowers will be able to withstand a cash rate of 3.5% is that the median mortgage buffer is now 21 months, which is to say the median borrower has got 21 months ahead of their repayments. And that's all well and good, except the 25th percentile has almost no buffer at all. And there are about 2.5 million families in that group. The median is irrelevant. Here's a graph of the last 7 housing downturns, the worst being more than 8% in 2017. Now, this one is expected to be deeper than that because of how much debt there is. And this graph explains what happened to us. It shows the value of all residential land as a percentage of GDP against bank lending as a percentage of GDP. Now, that tells you that house prices and debt took off when banks were deregulated in the 1980s and the shackles came off. And that's also when banks went from being mainly lenders to businesses, which employ people and create wealth, to being mainly lenders for housing, which doesn't, but it's safer and more profitable. The Australian dollar hardly moved today because the rate hike was fully expected. The local share market went up 1/3%, with gains by retailers and resources stocks offset by small declines by the banks. Wall Street was closed for Independence Day, while the markets in London and Tokyo went up and Shanghai went down. And commodity markets saw iron ore fall 2.5%, while oil, nickel and gold went up. And that's finance. Thanks for watching. You can check out more finance news by clicking there. And don't forget to click subscribe down there to get all the latest updates from ABC News.
"79-year-old Jo Scott has autoimmune issues and COVID. Her 87-year-old husband Malcolm is on dialysis and has COVID symptoms but has not tested positive. Neither have received antiviral drugs yet.
He's also got something that makes him extremely vulnerable. Now, really, somebody in this health organisation should be saying this is one of the people that really needs this straight away.
Right now, subsidised supply of the oral antivirals is limited to Australians most at risk of developing severe COVID. But with a fresh wave of Omicron variants now sweeping the nation, those in charge of overloaded hospitals want that to change.
There is 500,000 antivirals of the Pfizer antiviral in Australia already, but only about 20,000 have actually been used so far. So clearly there's an issue here.
The federal government agrees, taking the unusual step of asking the nation's Pharmaceutical Advisory Committee to broaden eligibility.
Expanding the age, reducing the number of risk factors that need to be demonstrated, so making this an easier process for those people.
Wider use of antivirals isn't the only strategy being considered to confront the new wave of highly infectious Omicron variants. The nation's immunisation experts will meet tomorrow to debate a wider rollout of vaccine fourth doses.
It may be that a target doesn't make any change, or it may be it simply reduces the age threshold down to something like 50, 55, as we see in some other countries.
I personally think that there's many people, me included, who's about 6 months since my third dose. I don't think I wouldn't mind a bit of a top-up in my immune protection heading into what I've now described as a wave that's coming.
Almost a third of eligible Australians are still yet to have their third dose. Evelyn Leckie, ABC News.
Well, rate hikes usually make the Australian dollar go up, but it's falling now and went below 68 US cents today for the first time since the depths of the pandemic in June 2020. It's because of forebodings about a recession here and globally. Now, as I pointed out last night, the futures market is expecting the cash rate to hit 3.5% next year, but it's also now betting that the RBA will be cutting rates in the second half of next year. And the market in longer-term interest rates is also anticipating a sharp economic slowdown. This is the 3-year Australian government bond rate, or the market interest rate on government IOUs. Now, those who invest in these things try to predict interest rates in 3 years' time, and they're starting to think they'll be a lot lower. And on the matter of recessions, it looks like America is already in one. US GDP in the first quarter of this year, up to the end of March, was minus 1.6%. And now the Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank's well-regarded prediction tool, called GDP Now, puts second quarter GDP at minus 2.1%. 2 consecutive negative quarters equals recession. And that led to heavy falls among commodities last night. Oil down nearly 10%, copper 4%, iron ore 3%, and gold 2.5%. And the result was some very hefty falls by mining and energy stocks on the Australian share market today. BHP, Rio Tinto, Newcrest, Santos, all down large, while technology stocks like Xero all benefited from the prospect of lower interest rates. US shares went up a bit last night after a day off, but share markets in Asia fell quite heavily. And that's finance. Thanks for watching. You can check out more finance news by clicking there. And don't forget to click subscribe down there to get all the latest updates from ABC News.
Mr. Grossi, how high are the obstacles for Australia to obtain your approval for a nuclear submarine program?
We shouldn't be fooling ourselves. This is a complex operation. It has to do with a nuclear reactor inside a vessel that for some time, unlike a normal nuclear reactor on land, if you want, will be exempted, will not be inspected regularly as our nuclear inspectors do all over the world in any nuclear facility. So the trick here is to find a way, which is technically possible, but still must be negotiated, to make sure that we have points of entry, point of exit, where we can ascertain that the nuclear material has not been tampered with, that there is no less nuclear material, that nothing has happened in between, in this intersection, that would be tantamount to nuclear proliferation in this case.
Let me ask you this. The submarines that Australia is planning to use will have reactors fueled by highly enriched or weapons-grade uranium. Is that where the regulatory problems lie?
It's not because it is high enriched uranium. Whatever material you have, uranium, plutonium, whatever material you may have, falls under the inspection regime of the IAEA. So a nuclear submarine can have high enriched uranium or low enriched uranium. And by the way, Australia has still to define what kind of submarine class, what kind of technology, what kind of approach is going to have. And then we will know. In any case, high enriched, low enriched uranium, we must inspect it.
Now, would your agency have concerns if Australia decided to produce its own highly enriched uranium, that's to say weapons-grade uranium, for use in its own submarines in the future?
Well, weapon grade, when you talk about weapon grade, you have to bear in mind that you are talking about 90% enrichment. So it is not a given that this is the level of enrichment that Australia would be using. Probably it would be less than that. But your question has another aspect on whether we would be concerned if Australia decided to embark on an uranium enrichment project. I don't think this is the case, but if it was, this is not out of line with international norms. The only thing you need to do is to subject your operations to stringent inspections by the IAEA.
How heavy is the lobbying from China and Russia to stop your approval?
Well, I think it is a public matter that some countries have characterized this project as a negative development, even as something that might round counter to international non-proliferation norms. As I said, the international norms do allow or do not forbid countries from pursuing naval nuclear propulsion, but of course this must be done in the right way, and here's the key of the issue. The rest is part of a political debate, which is natural. We are living in a world with increased geostrategic tensions, and one could expect this to also be part of that discussion.
Thank you very much for joining us.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
There is always an appointed acting Prime Minister who indeed has made himself available. And we've seen Richard Marles, when he was in that role just 24 hours ago, engaging with New South Wales emergency response. So these things all work together. And in terms
of... It's a protection racket. That's why you're doing it. You're protecting a clearly inept and unprepared Prime Minister. That's what it is.
We were acting. We are not a one-person show. I was fulfilling a responsibility that I believe that I had of travelling to Ukraine. To compare that with a holiday is, I just find, beyond contempt, frankly. And it says a lot about the people who made those comments. And I thank Premier Perrottet for his response when asked about it. That's what people want to see. People want to see people working together in the national interest.
And I know in some quarters the Prime Minister is being criticised for being away. What I would say is, from my perspective, the federal government needs to balance international concerns and domestic concerns. But as soon as he could, he picked up the phone to call me.
But I have said that I don't think his focus has been in the right place. It's not so much where Mr Albanese has been, it's his focus on everyday problems for Australians. We've got huge problems in this country with interest rates going up, inflation, cost of living very hard for people, an energy crisis on our hands. And Mr Albanese has just been handed off. He has just not been hands-on in tackling these major countries facing our nation. Now, in saying that, I thought the trip to Paris was surplus to requirements, as you say. I mean, it basically seemed to be a continuation of Mr Albanese's election campaign slanging match with the former Prime Minister Scott Morrison. That just seemed pointless, particularly given Emmanuel Macron was in Madrid for the separate NATO meeting. He could have caught up with him there rather than go to Paris as well. But look, that's not the principal issue here. The principal issue is not the Prime Minister's location. Yeah. It is the fact that he's absent-minded and not focused on domestic issues. He's also taken this ridiculous stance, Greg, that while he's overseas, he won't comment on domestic matters. Yeah. I mean, does he not have email or contact with people back home to understand what's going on in this country? Because that would be a real concern, I think, to most Australians if that's true.
I'm certainly keen to explore that because it's an interesting reversion to something that I think was adopted by Prime Ministers of yesteryear. But Patrick Gorman, to you, we're just picking up this line of criticism. Is there any sense in which the Prime Minister might need to check his travel plans into the future? Is it an easy trap to fall into to just accept one too many invitations?
Some on the coalition side are talking as if the Prime Minister's been having pina coladas and playing the ukulele on a beach somewhere. I mean, it's ridiculous. He was at the NATO meeting, the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation meeting, which Australia had been invited to, discussing Australia's vital national interests, following which he was in Paris and then in a war zone. And if this is the maturity of the debate, I think the Australian people deserve a lot better than that. And I think it's also diminishing the role of government. What we know is that government is not one person, it is a team. The Prime Minister has said that very clearly. There was an acting Prime Minister. Now, maybe under previous governments, people haven't had as much faith in their deputy, and maybe that was the case under the former government. But I think we need to be a bit more mature about this and a bit more mature about prosecuting Australia's interests, both at home and abroad.